Hi Niels, thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to ask you briefly to introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your background and your role.
Sure, yeah. I'm originally from the Philippines, but I came here to the U.S. for undergrad, where I majored in biology, and I also minored in dance. I went to Oberlin College, which is, I don't know, for people who know, is the kind of place where you can do that kind of thing. But after I graduated, I worked at an immunology lab for a little bit, going into my biology background, and then I sort of ended up in grad school doing public health at Columbia in New York, and that's where I first got into data science and machine learning.
Nice. As a machine learning engineer at Talkspace, what are some of the main projects you're working on, and what sort of societal changes are you having to overcome in your role at the moment?
So let's see. So just to take a step back on what Talkspace, the company I'm at, does, it's basically a therapy mental health service through a text messaging app. People can send audio and video messages as well, but most of the time people and their therapists will just be sending text messages to each other. So on that front, I'm really excited about two projects that I'm working on right now. So the first one is around crisis risk detection. So if you think about eating disorders, self-harm, we're trying to classify a person's risk during the course of therapy. And so based on the text messages that the client is sending to their therapist, we'll send an alert to the therapist if we think there's a high likelihood of crisis risk. So that's the first piece that we actually just launched last month. So I'm really excited to sort of start measuring and analyzing whether the system works or not. And I'm heading up those efforts as well to look at the efficacy of our crisis risk model. The second piece I'm working on is sort of this broader efficacy framework. So this crisis risk model lives within this broader therapist notification system. So we have this tool that sends alerts and reminders and tools to therapists during the course of therapy. So not all of these features are machine learning based, but this is where the more classic statistical models, statistical techniques like hypothesis testing comes in. And so I'm also helping on those, on that effort.
Nice. Unfortunately, mental health conditions aren't uncommon and affect a large amount of people. So how do you see, obviously for various reasons, people might not be comfortable going to clinicians or whatever it may be. So what do you see as some of the main benefits of the service that you're offering for those people that may not necessarily be sort of as comfortable to go and see someone and talk about what's happening?
Yeah, so the main philosophy of Talkspace is that clinicians and like human experts, therapists, licensed therapists are an important part of this equation. So what we're striving to build our tools really to help therapists and their clients build and maintain a strong relationship. And to your question about people who may not opt to receive face-to-face care, it really is just a messaging app.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who might be shy or might not know who the right kind of therapist for them is, they'll have an opportunity to try it out. It might not be for everyone, it might not be for you at a particular, at this particular moment in time. But really it's a way for people to experience therapy through a very familiar.
Nice. Have you ever come across or had any issues when it comes to bias in the models or anything of that kind?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that I'm very passionate about. I kind of came from a public health sociology background, and so I didn't have like a typical classic, computer science engineering background. And a lot of the things I was studying in grad school in public health was around social disparity, trying to unpack the social determinants of health. And so when we're building these AI models, I think one of the things that's really important is to look at social bias. And unfortunately, the word bias is overloaded in these kinds of discussions. So there's machine learning bias, there's statistical bias, and then more colloquially, there's social bias. And these kinds of bias are all, I think, interlinked, but I would consider them to be separate, conceptually and practically speaking.
Seen under the same umbrella in many instances, but
Yeah, you can find instances when they're kind of the same thing.
sure.
So what this means in my work in particular is, so around crisis risk, the way we're using the prediction is not this definitive kind of thing like hiring or like financial loan grants where you're like, it's a binary decision. Really, it's kind of this gradient where we send an alert and then the therapist has to figure out what to do with that information. But when it comes to this kind of bias, I think the thing that's relevant for our system is something called differential performance. So when the performance of the model is different for different groups of people. And so there are technical solutions to this, but really at the end of the day, you have to think critically about how you're using the model and how it's affecting people in the real world.
Sure. How closely are you working with the clinicians with Talkspace, and is that something that's very important to you guys sort of developing going forward?
Yeah, for sure. We're super lucky to have an in-house clinical team. So we work with therapists who are on our platform, but we also have people who are employed at Talkspace who are clinicians and therapists themselves. So they are critical. I mean, throughout this project in particular, and future projects as well, they help with the problem formulation, how to set up the supervised machine learning task, like what kinds of labels to use. They also helped us gather labeled data, so we have a lot of unlabeled data, most of which is text.
Yep.
So we'll have to sample that in some way. We have 6 labelers. We can't throw this at Amazon Mechanical Turk. So we have a couple dozen, half dozen labelers, and so we have to be very smart about what instances, what examples we show for them to label. After we get that, then we train our models, see if there is actually value there in our data. So kind of end to end, they also help us debug and diagnose our models, figure out how to use it in our product. So there's a critical piece there that they help.
They play a large part in the development. Yeah. Where, in that sort of same instance, where do you see Talkspace, say, in the next 12 months or so?
So right now so for the history of the company, we've mostly been B2C, and we a couple years ago expanded to a B2B offering. So we're working with companies like Google to offer this to their employees. We're working with insurance providers so that anyone who's covered under that plan has access to our service. So as we expand our B2B offering, there's going to be a lot of work. They're like Google, for example, is very data-driven, so they want to see if things are working. And so what this means for the data science team is building more of these ML-based tools, doing a lot of the data analysis, seeing what works and what doesn't, and adapting. So I'm excited to contribute to those efforts.
Nice. What do you see as some of the main industries or any other industries you're not currently working in that could potentially benefit from what Talkspace is doing?
One of the things I'm really excited about is the intersection of human-centered design and machine learning. So typically, when you think of machine learning, it's a highly technical field. I think more and more it's becoming a mainstream idea that we're embedding these things in very socially impactful systems. So human-centered design has also been around. So the interaction of these two things is something that I work with product managers and product people and our clinicians and everyone else in the team to try and figure out how to best build products. And machine learning, honestly, is a small component of that. It's I see it as like a function that you can automate certain parts of the workflow to improve efficiencies. But working at Talkspace brings about a lot of opportunities to figure out how to kind of responsibly build ML models and integrate them into these systems. So I think maybe, I started working there last year, so maybe as I come upon more and more projects, some kind of common patterns, especially that transfer over to things like hiring and criminal justice, things like that. where ML is being used in very critical decisions, might be able to transfer over.
Nice. I mean, you work sort of in the cross-section of AI and healthcare, and what do you see as some of the sort of main skills required to be in that sort of niche space?
Yeah, that's, I kind of stumbled into it. I mean, I was in kind of biology research, and then I went into public health, and then ended up in machine learning. So I feel pretty lucky getting into it kind of at the elbow of the curve before. I think I got into it like right as big data, data science were becoming like hype terms. So my bias is, I think, obviously the technical skills like software engineering and machine learning and stats are important, but what I found actually quite valuable is my humanities and sciences background. So, you know, in undergrad I took philosophy classes, sociology classes, all different sorts of courses that I have this perspective that's not just technical. I can look at problems, and it's important for me to look at problems from multiple angles. So we're not building these systems in a vacuum. It's, as I said, embedded in social systems. So I think a broad skill set and then ramping up on machine learning and those technical skills, I think, is where people should be going.
Brilliant. Just to wrap up, where can we find more of your work? How can we keep up with what you're doing?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not the most active Twitter user, but you can find me on Cosmic B-Boy. I used to be a breakdancer, so that's kind of stuck. So you can find me there.
Oh, brilliant. And what's next for you? What do you see as your next sort of project? What are you working on going forward at the moment?
So at Talkspace, we're building out a treatment recommendation system. So given historical treatments and relationships between therapists and their clients, what kinds of tools and treatments have they given that were successful? So that's a big, probably many-year project that we'll iterate on. We're building a transcript summarization system, so more tools to help therapists kind of understand what the history has been. And so those are two that I'm really excited about. Personally, I'm working on sort of fairness in ML, the intersection of that and automated machine learning. So with my limited free time, that's what I look into.
Brilliant. We look forward to keeping up with that on your socials and through Talkspace. Brilliant. Thank you for your time, Joe.
Thanks for having me.